November 2nd, 1920, began like any other autumn day in Ocoee, Florida, a small town tucked away near Orlando. The air was crisp, the streets familiar to its residents, and the excitement of a presidential election filled the atmosphere. For many Americans, Election Day is a celebration of civic duty, a moment to exercise the hard-won right to vote. But for the black residents of Ocoee, that day would become a nightmare, a moment when hope and freedom were met with unimaginable violence. Mose Norman, a determined African-American citrus farmer, woke up that morning ready to cast his ballot. Across town, families prepared for the election with the same determination, aware that participating in the democratic process was not just a right but a statement of dignity and resilience. After decades of systemic oppression, Black Americans were striving to claim the voice that was legally theirs, yet socially denied. Little did they know that the day's ordinary rhythm would be shattered by fear and hatred. A white, fueled by racial animosity and a desire to maintain dominance, mobilized to prevent black residents from exercising their rights. This was not spontaneous anger, it was a planned and calculated effort to intimidate, to enforce a social order that sought to silence the voices of those who dared to dream of equality. As the morning sun rose, the streets of Ocoee transformed from a peaceful town into a tense and dangerous battleground. Threats hung in the air. Whispers of violence passed from one corner to another, and the once trusted structures of law and order failed to protect the vulnerable. Mose Norman's attempt to vote became a symbol of resistance, a small act of courage in the face of an overwhelming wave of oppression. By mid-morning, the situation escalated rapidly. Neighbors watched in fear as the mob's presence grew, and chaos began to unfold. Homes were surrounded, families were terrorized, and the very fabric of the community trembled under the weight of hatred. For the black residents, this day was meant to be a celebration of citizenship and agency. Yet it became a test of survival, forcing ordinary people into extraordinary circumstances. This is the story of a community whose pursuit of justice and equality met with brutal opposition, a story that has remained largely absent from school textbooks, hidden in the shadows of history. But by remembering these events, by sharing the truth, we honor the courage of those who faced impossible odds and bring to light the lessons that history offers. If you want to uncover more untold stories of resilience and courage from the past, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss future explorations of history's hidden truths. Today, we journey into the events of that fateful November day in Ocoee, shedding light on a chapter of American history that demands to be remembered. As the sun climbed higher over Ocoee on that fateful November morning, Mose Norman, a respected citrus farmer and a man of quiet determination, made his way toward the polling station, fully aware of the risks he faced merely by exercising the right that the Constitution granted him. Years of systemic oppression and unspoken threats had taught black citizens in Florida to proceed cautiously. Yet Norman carried himself with the dignity of someone who believed that the principles of democracy must be upheld, no matter the personal cost. He had carefully prepared for this day, ensuring that his poll tax was paid and his paperwork in order, but the local authorities, already complicit in the climate of intimidation, refused him entry. Their words were veiled threats disguised as administrative obstacles, denying him the simple act of casting a ballot. While shadows of hostility lurked at every corner, Norman's refusal to retreat, his insistence that he and his fellow citizens had the right to participate in the electoral process, drew the attention of white residents who were determined to maintain their dominance and suppress black political engagement. Tension rippled through the streets as whispers spread about Norman's defiance. It was in this tense atmosphere that his friend, Julie Perry, a community leader who had long advocated for voter registration and civic participation among black residents, became the focus of the mob's ire. Perry was not a man accustomed to confrontation. Yet he had always stood as a protector for his neighbors, someone willing to defend his home and his family when threatened. That day, his courage would be tested in ways that no person should ever endure. When the mob arrived at Perry's property, intent on locating Norman and quelling any acts of resistance, the confrontation quickly escalated into violence. Perry's resolve was evident as he attempted to defend his home, not out of aggression, but out of necessity, understanding that surrender would mean leaving his family and community vulnerable to harm. The mob, undeterred by reason or justice, reacted with brutality. Perry was pulled from the relative safety of his home, beaten severely by the crowd, his body a testament to the raw aggression that had been unleashed. Despite his injuries, the law offered him no sanctuary. He was arrested and taken into custody. Yet even the supposed protection of the legal system could not shield him from the malice that had been stirred by Norman's act of defiance and the community's desire for fairness. The next morning, Perry's ordeal escalated further as a lynch mob extricated him from police custody, subjecting him to another round of violence before executing him in a public display meant to terrorize any who might follow in his footsteps. The image of Perry, beaten, restrained, and ultimately murdered by those who sought to silence a community, became emblematic of the lengths to which white supremacist structures would go to maintain control and suppress the rights of Black Americans. His death was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a deliberate message sent to the entirety of Ocoee's Black population, a warning that asserting one's rights could provoke deadly consequences. What made the horror of that day even more harrowing was the systematic nature of the violence. The mob, emboldened by the complicity and inaction of local authorities, moved with precision and purpose. They targeted the homes and properties of Black residents, seeking to dismantle the community both physically and psychologically. Perry's home, once a symbol of stability and family life, was reduced to ashes, and the neighborhood itself became a theater of fear and destruction. Families were forced to flee in the dead of night, carrying what few belongings they could manage, stumbling into darkness that offered no refuge. Some sought safety in the swamps, where nature itself became a peril, as alligators claimed victims among those who desperately tried to escape the flames and the mob's wrath. Amid this, the courage of individuals like Norman and Perry stands in stark contrast to the cruelty surrounding them. Norman's steadfast attempt to vote, despite repeated intimidation and direct threats, illustrates a profound commitment to justice and civic responsibility, a belief that the act of participating in democracy could challenge the entrenched systems of oppression. Perry's defense of his home and his community underscores a different, but equally powerful form of bravery, a readiness to protect the people around him, even in the face of insurmountable odds. Their actions were neither reckless nor solitary. They were connected to a larger struggle for recognition, equality, and the right to live without fear in one's own town. Yet, the consequences of that day rippled far beyond Norman and Perry. The Black community of Ocoee was shattered, driven from the town, and stripped of property, security, and the right to feel safe in their own neighborhoods. Homes, schools, churches, and businesses that had taken years to build were destroyed, leaving scars that would last for generations. The massacre served as a cruel reminder that exercising legal rights could provoke violent reprisal, and it left an indelible mark on the memory and consciousness of those who survived. Despite the passage of time, the legacy of November 2nd, 1920, continues to remind us of both the destructive power of hatred and the enduring strength of those who resist it, even when faced with the most extreme forms of injustice. In weaving together the stories of Mose Norman and Julie Perry, the events of that day emerge not as abstract statistics or historical footnotes, but as deeply human narratives of courage, defiance, and resilience in the face of systemic oppression. Their experiences compel reflection on the fragility of rights when confronted by violence, the responsibilities of communities to protect one another, and the enduring need to remember and honor those who stood bravely when so many forces conspired against them. As night fell over Ocoee, the town's streets, which had seemed so familiar and ordinary just hours earlier, became engulfed in flames and terror. The white mobs that had set their sights on suppressing the black community moved with a terrifying coordination, sweeping through neighborhoods that had been home to families for decades. The sound of crackling fire and shattering glass pierced the air, mingling with the panicked cries of those trying to escape. Each home they entered was reduced to ashes, carrying with it the memories, possessions, and the hard-earned security of the families who had once lived there. Churches, which had served as centers of community and spiritual refuge, were not spared, their sacred walls collapsing under the assault, leaving nothing but smoldering ruins as a haunting testament to the night's destruction. Schools that had nurtured the dreams and aspirations of children were similarly consumed, eliminating safe spaces where education and hope had once flourished. Local businesses, built through years of labor and careful management, were looted and destroyed, erasing livelihoods and leaving the survivors with little more than the clothes on their backs. Amid this orchestrated chaos, the black residents faced impossible choices, each fraught with danger. Those who fled their burning homes did so into darkness and uncertainty, carrying frightened children, elderly relatives, and the fragments of their lives as best they could. The streets offered little safety. The mob's presence felt relentless, as if the very town had turned against them. In the desperate scramble to escape, some families were driven toward the swamps that fringed the town, hoping that the dense foliage and murky waters might conceal them from the violence pursuing them. Yet these swamps were treacherous, home to alligators that lurked unseen beneath the water's surface. In their frantic flight, some of the town's residents fell victim to these natural dangers, their fates intertwined with the horrors of human cruelty that had forced them into the swamp in the first place. Women shielding their children, men carrying what few possessions they could grasp, and the elderly struggling to keep pace with the terror around them all faced the same grim reality. Survival was uncertain, and the landscape offered no guarantee of safety. The fire and destruction continued through the night, an unrelenting onslaught designed not only to punish but to erase. Each building destroyed carried more than its physical weight. It represented the erasure of community, culture, and identity. The black residents of Ocoee had built a network of support, places where families gathered, children learned, and neighbors relied upon one another. Yet the mob sought to dismantle these structures in a single night of coordinated violence. Streets that had once hosted laughter, markets, and celebrations were transformed into avenues of smoke and despair. Families huddled together wherever they could find cover, often in basements, sheds, or even under trees, listening to the crackle of burning wood and the distant shouts of those who sought to harm them. The night was long, each hour stretching as fear compounded, yet even in the darkness, the determination to survive pushed many onward, moving through smoke-filled alleys and treacherous terrain in the hope of reaching safety. The horror was compounded by the realization that the authority structures meant to protect citizens were either absent or complicit. Law enforcement failed to intervene, leaving the residents to navigate the chaos on their own. The absence of protection intensified the sense of vulnerability, as families understood that survival required relying solely on one another, on instinct, and on the courage to flee into the unknown. Within this crucible of fear, the bonds of community and familial loyalty were tested to the extreme. Parents shielded children from view, neighbors guided each other through the smoke, and strangers became allies in the shared struggle for life. Every decision whether to run toward the swamps, to hide in a partially destroyed building, or to attempt a passage through the flames was a calculation between life and death, one that demanded courage, quick thinking, and a measure of luck. By dawn, the landscape of Ocoee had been irrevocably altered. The black neighborhoods that had once been vibrant with life were now reduced to smoldering ruins. A tableau of destruction that reflected both the calculated violence of the night and the enduring human cost of hatred and fear. Survivors emerged from hiding to find that their homes, places of worship, centers of learning, and livelihoods had all been consumed, leaving them with nothing but the certainty that their lives had been forever changed. The community's infrastructure, carefully built over generations, lay in, and those who had escaped the flames carried the trauma of loss and terror with them. Each scarred street and charred building stood as a reminder of what had been taken, and what had been risked simply by existing and asserting the basic rights that many took for granted elsewhere. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming destruction, stories of resilience and determination began to emerge. Survivors, though traumatized and displaced, held on to the knowledge that their community had existed and that its history mattered. They clung to memories of the lives they had built, of schools where children laughed, of churches where voices sang, and of neighborhoods where neighbors had celebrated together. The night of fire and terror may have destroyed buildings, but it could not entirely erase the human spirit. The events of that November night, while marking one of the darkest chapters in Ocoee's history, also became a testament to endurance, the quiet courage of those who fled, and the memory of a community that refused to be entirely erased, even as the smoke cleared and the sun rose over a town forever changed. In the aftermath of the terrifying night that had reduced Ocoee's black neighborhoods to ashes, the surviving residents faced a grim reality. Their homes, businesses, and community spaces were gone, and with them, the sense of security and belonging that had defined their lives. Those who had escaped the flames and the terror of the mobs found themselves uprooted, forced to flee not just for hours or days, but permanently, as the town they had called home became uninhabitable. Families carried what few possessions they could salvage, traveling with weary children, aging relatives, and the etching weight of loss, knowing that returning to the streets they had once walked safely would invite certain danger. The streets, once lined with homes full of laughter, schools alive with learning, and churches filled with the sounds of celebration, now stood silent, scarred by fire and violence. A stark warning to anyone who might have considered standing against the entrenched racial power structures that had orchestrated the attack. As the black residents dispersed, many were compelled to leave not only their homes but also the land they had worked for years, land that represented their labor, their wealth, and their dreams for the future. Citrus groves that had taken decades to cultivate, houses built with care and pride, and small businesses that had been nurtured through perseverance and skill were abandoned or forcibly taken from their owners. The process was systematic. In the wake of the violence, opportunistic individuals moved quickly to claim these properties, often through coercion or manipulation, and in many cases without any form of compensation to the rightful owners. The legal and civic systems that should have protected property rights and ensured justice for the victims were either complicit or indifferent, allowing the seizure and sale of these assets to proceed with impunity. The loss was not only material but deeply symbolic, stripping the black community of its economic foundations and its stake in the town's future. This forced displacement reshaped the demographic landscape of Ocoee almost overnight. Where once hundreds of black families had lived, worked, and thrived, only a handful remained, their presence tenuous and fragile. Census records in the years following the massacre show a dramatic decline in the black population, reflecting both the immediate flight and the longer-term reluctance of families to return to a place that had so vividly demonstrated the lethal consequences of asserting their rights. The communal fabric that had bound neighbors together was torn apart, leaving behind a sense of isolation and vulnerability that persisted for decades. Those who did attempt to return often encountered persistent discrimination, ongoing threats, and a social environment that remained hostile, reinforcing the lesson that their lives and livelihoods could be taken away without warning or recourse. The economic consequences of the massacre were equally profound. Families that had achieved a measure of independence through land ownership, trade, and entrepreneurship suddenly found themselves destitute, their property either destroyed or expropriated. The wealth that had been accumulated over generations was wiped out in a single day, leaving survivors with little more than the memory of what had been lost. The confiscation and sale of land and homes further entrenched inequality, concentrating wealth and property in the hands of those who had perpetrated or benefited from the violence, while the rightful owners were left to rebuild their lives from scratch, often in new towns or cities where support networks were scarce. This displacement reinforced the systemic barriers that had long limited the economic mobility of Black Americans in the South, demonstrating how violence could be wielded as a tool not only of terror but of economic control. Beyond the material and demographic consequences, the psychological impact on those forced to flee was profound. Families were haunted by the memory of neighbors killed, homes burned, and the sound of gunfire and destruction that had filled the night. The trauma of witnessing such calculated violence created a lingering fear that shaped their interactions with the broader community for years to come. Parents struggled to explain to their children why their homes were gone, why the friends and relatives who had once been a part of daily life were now dispersed across the state, and why returning was no longer safe. The experience of forced displacement became interwoven with stories of survival and resilience, shaping generational memory and influencing how the community understood justice, safety, and the value of standing up for one's rights. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming loss, the narrative of Ocoee's Black residents is also one of quiet perseverance. Those who resettled elsewhere carried with them the knowledge of what had been taken, and the determination to rebuild in new spaces. Preserving traditions, memories, and aspirations despite the devastation, they became witnesses to the consequences of racial violence and systemic injustice, their stories serving as enduring reminders of the costs of intolerance and the resilience of the human spirit. The forced exodus of nearly the entire Black population, and the seizure of their properties without compensation, stands as a testament to the intersection of violence, greed, and prejudice. Yet it also underscores the capacity of communities to endure, adapt, and persist, even when the foundations of their lives are violently dismantled. Through this lens, the events of November 2nd, 1920, in Ocoee are not merely historical incidents but deeply human experiences, revealing how the interplay of fear, power, and systemic inequities can reshape entire communities. The flight of the Black population and the confiscation of their property illustrate the stakes of civic engagement and the consequences of challenging entrenched hierarchies. Yet they also highlight the enduring courage of those who, despite the odds, refuse to let their existence be erased from memory. In telling their story, we recognize both the horrors inflicted and the strength of those who survived, ensuring that the lessons of displacement, loss, and resilience continue to inform our understanding of justice and community today. In the weeks and months that followed the massacre in Ocoee, a grim silence descended over the town, one that was not born of forgetfulness but of deliberate neglect and deliberate manipulation. The Black community, already traumatized by the violence and displacement, found itself further marginalized by the very institutions that should have served justice and documented truth. local authorities, from law enforcement to municipal officials, acted with either indifference or tacit approval, failing to record the scope of the deaths, the injuries, and the destruction wrought upon the town. Where one might have expected careful documentation and a formal investigation, there was instead an eerie absence, as though the events of that night were too inconvenient, too shameful, or too threatening to acknowledge. Reports were scant, records incomplete, and any attempt by survivors or community members to demand accountability met with bureaucratic resistance or outright dismissal, leaving families without recourse or recognition for the suffering they had endured. The media, for its part, often participated in a systematic erasure of the truth, presenting a narrative that downplayed the severity of the violence or framed it in a way that minimized the culpability of the white mobs. Newspapers that had chronicled daily life in Ocoee now shifted their tone, focusing on minor damages or portraying the black residents as instigators of conflict. A cruel inversion of reality that further victimized those who had already suffered unimaginable horrors. The stories of families fleeing into the night, of homes and churches consumed by fire, and of neighbors beaten and killed were either ignored or sanitized, leaving the broader public unaware of the scale of the atrocity. In many cases, journalists relied on the testimony of white residents or officials who had a vested interest in suppressing the truth, creating a historical record that was at best incomplete and at worst deliberately misleading. The massacre, which should have been a defining event in the history of the town and a critical example of the dangers of racial violence and voter suppression, became instead a footnote, a shadow in the official narrative, and a chapter largely omitted from public memory and education. The consequences of this erasure were profound and enduring. Without official records or comprehensive reporting, the families of victims were denied recognition and validation. Their losses treated as if they were unworthy of remembrance. The absence of documentation also hindered any attempts at legal redress or restitution, as evidence that might have supported claims was never formally recorded or preserved. Property stolen or destroyed during the massacre remained in the hands of those who had seized it, with little hope of restitution, while survivors and their descendants were left to navigate a system that had systematically failed them. The lack of acknowledgement extended beyond legal and material concerns, affecting the psychological and communal memory of Ocoee itself. Generations of residents, both black and white, grew up without learning the full story, and the silence created a cultural gap in which the massacre was effectively erased from local consciousness. Schools did not teach it, local commemorations did not occur, and public markers or memorials were non-existent for decades, leaving an entire chapter of American history neglected, invisible, and unexamined. This deliberate neglect had ramifications that reached far beyond Ocoee, reflecting a broader pattern of historical suppression in the South and across the United States. By failing to document the massacre, officials and media contributed to a culture in which the suffering of black citizens could be ignored without consequence. The erasure of records, the distortion of reporting, and the refusal to acknowledge the violence publicly meant that subsequent generations inherited an incomplete understanding of civic participation, racial dynamics, and the consequences of systemic injustice. Children growing up in the area were told little, if anything, about the events that had unfolded in their own backyards, and the stories passed down through families were often fragmented, reliant on oral memory that could be challenged or dismissed in the absence of formal evidence. The combination of fear, institutional indifference, and historical whitewashing created a landscape in which truth was obscured, justice was deferred indefinitely, and collective memory was shaped by silence rather than acknowledgement. Yet in the midst of this suppression, small acts of preservation and resistance emerged, as determined individuals and later historians worked to reconstruct the story from whatever fragments remained. Letters, personal testimonies, death certificates, census records, and smuggled documents became invaluable in piecing together the events of that fateful night, revealing the scale of the violence and the scope of the injustice that had been inflicted. These efforts highlighted both the resilience of the survivors and the importance of memory in the face of systemic erasure. The painstaking work of researchers and descendants eventually led to the creation of memorials, historical markers, and curricula that began to educate the public about Ocoee's true history. Yet the absence of official acknowledgement for so many decades left scars that remain visible in the collective consciousness of the community. The Ocoee Massacre stands as a stark reminder of the consequences of ignoring truth and failing to hold institutions accountable. The deliberate absence of official records and the whitewashing of media accounts not only compounded the immediate suffering of the victims, but also denied future generations the ability to fully understand the human cost of racial violence and voter suppression. It illuminates the critical role of historical documentation and media integrity in shaping collective memory and underscores how silence and neglect can perpetuate injustice across time. Through the work of historians, community members, and advocates, the stories of those who suffered and survived are slowly being restored, reclaiming a chapter of history that had been nearly erased and ensuring that the lessons of Ocoee are no longer hidden from view. By the time the 1930 census was recorded, the landscape of Ocoee had been irrevocably transformed, reflecting not only the immediate devastation of the 1920 massacre, but also the enduring impact of fear, displacement, and systemic oppression that shaped the decades to follow. From a once thriving community of Black residents who had lived, worked, and invested in their town, only two remained, a stark testimony to the overwhelming force of violence and intimidation that had purged the population almost entirely. The streets that had echoed with the sounds of children playing, church bells ringing, and neighbors conversing over fences were now dominated by silence, punctuated only by the routines of the white residents who had either remained unscathed or moved in to occupy the properties left behind. Homes that had been lovingly built, businesses painstakingly established, and lands painstakingly cultivated were now occupied by new hands. The ownership shift both a symbol and a consequence of the deep racial violence that had swept the community. The near-total absence of Black residents created not only a physical void but also an erasure of history, culture, and presence. A community memory suppressed as though those who had once lived there had never existed. The remaining Black residents lived under a constant shadow of threat and uncertainty, their presence a reminder of what had been lost and a target for the latent prejudices that persisted long after the violence had subsided. The social and political landscape was rigidly structured to maintain white dominance, reinforced by laws, local policies, and the social acceptance of racial exclusion. Black families who might have considered returning or settling in Ocoee were deterred not only by memories of the massacre, but by an unyielding environment where discrimination was embedded in everyday life. Schools, public spaces, and civic institutions remained segregated. Employment opportunities were limited, and any assertion of equality or resistance to injustice was met with overt hostility or subtle exclusion. The town, while physically rebuilt in parts, remained psychologically and culturally scarred, with the absence of Black voices and experiences reinforcing a monocultural narrative that whitewashed the town's true history and ensured that systemic racism continued to dictate the social order for decades. Economically, the consequences of the massacre reverberated through generations. Properties that had been seized, sold under duress, or abandoned were rarely returned to the families who had originally owned them, and in many cases, the wealth that had been built through labor, enterprise, and land ownership was permanently lost. Black families who had survived the violence and sought to re-establish themselves elsewhere had to start over with little support, often relocating to distant towns or cities where they had to navigate new social hierarchies and economic barriers. The confiscation of property and the disruption of economic networks not only impoverished the victims but also reinforced racial inequality, ensuring that the wealth and influence accrued by black residents in the pre-massacre era could not be regained. The absence of restitution and accountability allowed systemic disparities to calcify, creating a legacy of economic marginalization that extended well into the mid-20th century and beyond. Socially, the long-term effects of the massacre fostered a pervasive climate of fear and silence. For decades, the memory of what had occurred was suppressed, both within Ocoee and in the broader narratives of Florida history. Black residents avoided public spaces associated with the massacre, passing on warnings and stories within families, while schools and local histories ignored the events, leaving young generations unaware of the tragedy that had shaped their town. This silence contributed to a cycle of invisibility, where systemic racism could persist unchallenged because the historical context that justified resistance and awareness had been deliberately obscured. White residents, meanwhile, benefited from a historical amnesia that reinforced social hierarchies and normalized exclusion, ensuring that the demographic shift created by violence was consolidated over time. The resulting town was not just almost entirely white in population, but was also dominated by cultural and institutional norms that marginalized black voices, limiting the potential for meaningful integration or reconciliation for decades. The civic and cultural consequences were equally stark. By eliminating nearly the entire black population, the massacre and its aftermath deprived Ocoee of the diversity and vibrancy that had characterized its early years. Community institutions such as churches, schools, and social clubs that had been integral to the black residents' daily lives ceased to function, either destroyed or abandoned, and their absence created voids that could not easily be filled. The cultural contributions of black residents, from music and religious traditions to culinary practices and local storytelling, were suppressed or erased, leaving a homogenized social fabric that celebrated one perspective while ignoring others. Attempts to commemorate or acknowledge the tragedy were long delayed, with official recognition and historical markers appearing only many decades later. A belated effort to honor lives lost and experiences erased, but one that could never fully restore the generational trauma and social fracture left behind. Yet, even amid this enduring exclusion, stories of resilience persisted beyond the borders of Ocoee. Descendants of those who fled carried memories of their families' homes, businesses, and community life, preserving oral histories and personal narratives that refused to be entirely erased by time or oppression. Scholars, activists, and community organizers eventually worked to reconstruct the history of the town, piecing together census records, letters, property deeds, and testimonies to reveal the depth of the injustice and its lasting impact. Their efforts served as both documentation and reclamation, ensuring that the events of November 1920 and the systemic forces that followed would not remain hidden. These efforts highlighted the contrast between the enforced absence in Ocoee and the resilience of a dispersed community that maintained identity, memory, and connection despite decades of exclusion. In examining Ocoee's nearly all-white reality by 1930, it becomes clear that the massacre was not a singular event but a catalyst for systemic transformation, one that reshaped demographics, economics, culture, and power structures. The lasting effects of displacement, property loss, and racial exclusion reveal how deeply violence can affect the trajectory of a community and how systemic racism can perpetuate itself in both visible and invisible ways. While Ocoee eventually began to reckon with its past, acknowledging the massacre through markers, education, and public discourse, the decades-long absence of black residents underscores the enduring consequences of unchecked prejudice and the ways in which historical erasure can consolidate social hierarchies. Understanding this history is essential, not merely as a record of tragedy, but as a lesson in vigilance, civic responsibility, and the ongoing need to confront and address systemic inequities in every generation. As we reflect on the long-overlooked events that unfolded in Ocoee on that fateful November day in 1920, it becomes clear that the massacre was not just a local tragedy but a stark reflection of the broader struggles for civil rights, justice, and recognition faced by African Americans throughout U.S. history. The violence that erupted was born of entrenched racism, the desire to suppress black political participation, and the willingness of white mobs to enforce a system of fear and control through sheer brutality. For decades, the story of Ocoee was hidden, whitewashed, and omitted from textbooks and public discourse, leaving generations unaware of the courage, suffering, and resilience of those who lived through it. Black residents who survived were driven from their homes, their property seized or sold without compensation, and their presence in the town erased almost entirely, creating a social and cultural void that would last for decades. Yet today, efforts to reclaim this history are gaining ground. Historical markers have been erected, including one in Heritage Square outside the Orange County Regional History Center, to honor the memory of Julie Perry and the other victims whose lives were so violently taken. These markers serve not just as memorials but as tangible reminders of the human cost of racial violence and voter suppression, ensuring that the lessons of Ocoee are not forgotten. Educational initiatives in schools are beginning to incorporate the events into their curricula, teaching students about the realities of systemic oppression, the struggles for black suffrage, and the resilience of communities that faced unimaginable adversity. By confronting this painful history, students and citizens alike gain a more honest understanding of the nation's past and the forces that shaped its present. These initiatives help illuminate the ways in which institutional neglect, media erasure, and unchecked prejudice contributed to cycles of violence and exclusion, providing a necessary context for understanding ongoing struggles for racial equity and civil rights. The story of Ocoee is, in many, a microcosm of the broader pattern of racial violence and voter suppression in the United States. It exemplifies how African Americans who sought to exercise their constitutional rights were often met with intimidation, threats, and deadly force, and how communities were shaped by these acts of terror. The massacre underscores the importance of protecting democratic processes and ensuring that every citizen can participate fully and safely in civic life. It also highlights the dangers of historical erasure, reminding us that silencing narratives can perpetuate injustice across generations, rob communities of their heritage, and distort collective memory. By acknowledging and studying these events, society gains the tools to recognize systemic inequities and to challenge them in both civic and social spheres. Importantly, the recognition of Ocoee's history honors the resilience and courage of those who survived and those whose descendants have worked to preserve their stories. Families who fled carried with them the memory of homes, businesses, and community life that were violently taken. Yet they also preserved the knowledge of what had occurred, passing down oral histories that have become crucial to reconstructing the full narrative. Scholars, activists, and local organizations have painstakingly pieced together evidence from letters, death certificates, census records, and other historical documents to create a more complete and truthful account of the massacre. These efforts demonstrate the power of collective memory, research, and advocacy to challenge historical erasure and ensure that future generations can learn from the past rather than repeat its injustices. The Ocoee Massacre also serves as a reminder that confronting history is not merely about acknowledging past wrongs, it is about creating a foundation for justice, empathy, and inclusion in the present. By examining how systemic racism and voter suppression operated in 1920, we can better understand contemporary issues related to civil rights, equality, and access to political participation. The stories of those who resisted intimidation, defended their rights, and sought to maintain their dignity in the face of violence are powerful testaments to the enduring human spirit. They inspire continued vigilance against racial injustice and the ongoing work needed to ensure that democracy is truly accessible to all. As we honor the victims and survivors of Ocoee, it is also important to recognize the role of education, public awareness, and commemoration in fostering a society that values truth and justice. The historical markers, museum exhibits, and school curricula that now highlight this dark chapter not only acknowledge the lives lost, but also challenge us to reflect on the consequences of silence, indifference, and prejudice. They remind us that remembering history is a form of resistance against injustice, a commitment to truth, and a way to cultivate a more inclusive future where the mistakes of the past are neither ignored nor repeated. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Ocoee's history, a story that is as painful as it is necessary to understand. By learning about these events, we honor those who suffered and ensure that their experiences are remembered and never forgotten. We encourage you to continue exploring untold stories, to share this knowledge, and to engage in conversations about civil rights, history, and justice. If you found this video meaningful, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our future content, and help us spread awareness about these crucial narratives. Your engagement helps keep history alive, ensures the lessons of the past reach new audiences, and contributes to a world more conscious of the importance of equity, justice, and remembrance. Together, we can ensure that the tragedies of the past inform a better, more inclusive future for all.